come quite unexpectedly. So take cover at once.
The Russian Premier has told a meeting of Warsaw Pact heads of state that the USSR will not be bullied by the US and its NATO allies, who he accused of escalating the current crisis. He told the Assembly that the USSR stood ready to vigorously defend itself should Warsaw Pact sovereignty be threatened by the actions of NATO, and warned the United States that they were close to the point of no return in their relations with Moscow. The conference was followed by a parade of Soviet military hardware in what observers are calling a defiant show of force.
So what we're looking at now is a parade of some of the Cold War Soviet vehicles. The first vehicle going around, those of you who like your armoured vehicles, you might think this is something called a BMP-1. That was the Soviet armoured personnel carrier that came out in the 70s. Frightening vehicle because it could carry an anti-tank guided weapon on the top. So in other words, it could knock out a tank even though it wasn't a tank. The one you're looking at is actually a Czechoslovakian version of it, called the OT-90. They put a smaller turret on it, took off the 73mm gun. This is going to sound ridiculous, but at that time there was something called Conventional Forces Europe. If you've got a big gun on the top, they would have called it a tank. You were only allowed a certain number of tanks you could declare, so the Czechs put a different turret on, a smaller gun, so they could get away with it. So that's the OT-90. Behind it, what actually looks like a T-54 tank that you can see there, that's actually a Chinese copy of a T-54. The Russians gave the Chinese plans for their tanks. When the Chinese copied them, they changed them just a little bit, and they call them type tanks. So it's that particular tank is what actually is called a Type 59. But pretty much everything about it is exactly the same as the very famous and massively produced in terms of numbers T-54 and slightly improved tank called the T-55. And that was first designed, really based back on a wartime design. And the Russians were very, very good at that, just quietly, simply improving their vehicles over time. Very reliable engine, a diesel engine in the back, so it would start in all weathers. A very good basic gun, good sloped armour, crew conditions absolutely appalling. But again, in a dictatorship, as it was really, tough. If you were the crew member, you certainly didn't complain about it. Now behind the tank is the DDR3 RAM. That's the early type of reconnaissance vehicle. It was amphibious. You can see its wheels, quite a reconnaissance. These wheeled vehicles tracks tend to be a bit noisier. And the later version, the BRDM2, is driving along behind it. And then they vary again, very large numbers of these vehicles and lots of different variants that would do different roles on the battlefield. And following up the column of Soviet vehicles is the BTR-60. And for the Cold War era, that was the equivalent of our British Saladin armoured car or Saracen armoured personnel carrier. 6-wheeled, simple design, and you would have got a section of infantry in the back. And when they attack, they jump off over the sides to actually finish the attack on foot. Now, a lot of those Soviet vehicles, you may be able to see as they drive past, on the rear of them, there's almost like a keyhole shape, and that's where they actually had a water jet to be able to propel the vehicles through water. The Russians, of course, realized if they were going to attack the West, they were going to have to cross a lot of rivers running north into the North Sea, things like the Rhine, the Niederrhein. If they were going to get at us, they were going to have to cross those rivers. And to do that, they made a lot of their vehicles amphibious. They knew we would blow up bridges. So a lot of what might have been the Cold War was going to be about fighting for bridges and capturing bridges, because you're going to need to get across watercourses to carry on the advance. So that's our lineup there of some of the Soviet-era vehicles, and we'll see those again in a little while.
NATO forces are reported to be on a high state of alert following the build-up of Soviet military forces in Eastern Europe. The US president has described Moscow's latest deployments as highly provocative. NATO's reacted by moving its forces into defensive positions up and down the border with the Eastern Bloc. A Ministry of Defense spokesman said that British and NATO forces were ready to face any contingency. Meanwhile, trade unionists are leading a major peace rally in Trafalgar Square this morning. You may now be able to start seeing some of the NATO vehicles that were there lined up back in the 60s, 70s and 80s to potentially take on any Russian invasion. The parade began by 432s, that's armoured personnel carriers that the British Army put into service in the 60s, carrying the infantry forward in a similar manner to the BMP-1. Of course, however much technology, kits, satellites, missiles, whatever you've got, you still need infantry on the battlefield. They are vital for taking and holding ground. So the 432s are driving round. Behind them comes the British Chieftain tank. This really is a Cold War warrior, one of the massive tanks that Britain built after World War II, a huge, great 120mm gun, thick armour protection. The downside, of course, of the Chieftain was the slightly unreliable L60 engine. But we've got two Chieftains there going round. Not so good on mobility, but a tremendously powerful gun. And the accuracy of the gun on the Chieftain was such that they got it to about the point that 98 times out of 100, they could hit a target out to 3 kilometres away with the first round. And
being a fully stabilised gun, which means it'll lock on the target when the vehicle's on the move, the other great thing was you can fire actively on the move. And of course, if you can fire on the move, it means there's less of a chance of the enemy hitting you. The Soviet tanks would have to stop to aim their guns and fire. They could hit a moving target, but they need to stop to do it. And as soon as you're in a tank and you stop, you're a big target yourself. Now, following the CHIEFTAINs are two American M113 tanks. Again, a workhorse tank of the post-war era. The Americans, a bit like the Russians, carried on developing their tanks. The M48 was the first tank. That developed into the M60. And we've got two variants of the M60 driving around here. They were improved on all throughout their service life. But again, very sensibly, the Americans used the gun we've seen on quite a number of tanks. The British 105 L7 gun, very accurate gun, tremendously powerful. So two M60 tanks, that's followed by a reconnaissance vehicle, a Canadian vehicle, the Lynx. That was used for scouting. Don't forget the Canadians were part of NATO, they were there as well. And that in turn is followed by two Scorpion vehicles. The two Scorpions used for reconnaissance, and that again followed up by a rather odd looking vehicle, an air defence vehicle. Now of course, air defence very important for the NATO forces, as it was going to be also for the Warsaw Pact forces. This was the era not just of things like Harriers, which were going to be bombing the Russians if they'd advances, but also attack helicopters. And the Soviets went in for attack helicopters in a big way. So that peculiar last vehicle, it's called tracked Rapier. It's got Rapier air defence missiles on the back of it. The dome houses a radar. It's got an armoured cab on the front. And the idea there, of course, is so it can keep up with the tanks as they go into action and keep those tanks protected with some form of air defence system, so they're not vulnerable or that vulnerable to air attack. So we're going to park up some of that heavier armour out the way just for the moment. As you can see, we're getting them off the field there, and we'll see them again in a moment. But if you keep your eyes out, any moment now, you're going to see, keep your eyes and ears open, if you can hear it above the engine note of the vehicles, we're going to have a helicopter come in to say hello. The helicopter's a Lynx helicopter, and it's of a generation back in the 70s, still in service at the moment with the British Army. So it's been used by the Navy as well, and a whole host of countries bought this helicopter. It's called the Lynx, and if you watch over, follow away from the museum building and keep your eyes on the horizon, and you'll see a Lynx helicopter coming your way, and it's going to appear and come in close, so you can just have a closer look at it. And of course, helicopters in this area, when they first went into service, they could fire missiles. Some of those anti-tank missiles they would fire, some were wire-guided. In other words, they literally spooled out wire behind them, and you could control those from a joystick inside the helicopter, and you had to have line of sight on the target, as it's called. Nowadays, they tend to have weapons to fire at tanks, which are called fire and forget. As long as they put the target, press the button, they can then fly off quickly. Now the Lynx coming in today, it's come down from Middle Wallop. It's commanded by Major Simon Goff, and Major Goff's parents are in the audience, so thank you very much for coming along today and seeing your son fly this, or command this helicopter. The actual pilot is Captain Henry, and the gunner sits on that side door on the side of the aeroplane, of the helicopter, sorry. They open the door. The gunner on the side is Corporal James Bott. And again, if it was in firing at tanks, obviously it had missiles, but again it could come in. They've armed some of these helicopters with 50 caliber machine guns. They've taken snipers with them so that they can fire at targets on the ground. So you can see them there, give them a wave. They've come down today to show off this Lynx to us. The Lynx, of course, was built not that far away from here, up the road at Yeovil, where West Midlands helicopter people are based. Now the Lynx is going to be in service for a few more years, and it's going to be replaced by another type of helicopter the Army will be using, the Wildcat. And again, slightly confusing of course, but the Army uses helicopters as well as the RAF. This started all the way back in World War II when the Army put gunners in aeroplanes, light aeroplanes, to be able to fly over the battlefield. They decided it was much better. It was actually Churchill who decided that the Army ought to have its own sort of air wing, and that's developed over time, and so it's the Army who are flying, of course, aircraft today like the Apache helicopter. Now the Lynx is just going to pop off, and keep your eyes on it because it's going to drop down behind a tree line and just show you what it might do in a combat situation. It doesn't do what it's just done for us, which is show itself off. In a real battle, of course, it will drop down behind trees, pop up, not give enough time for the enemy to place their weapons, their sights on it, fire off its missiles, and then disappear again. And if you see a helicopter tree hopping like our Lynx is doing at the moment, you realise they're very difficult things to actually see in the landscape. Disappeared from view, and then he'll reappear, fire at us, and disappear again. Or at least he's not going to fire at us, do not panic. And there he is, those of you can see him, he's popped above the tree line. And disappears down again. And of course, pilots are looking at the landscape all the time, judging what's the best way forward, what's the best way to actually approach a target, what's the best way to attack. Just like as a tank commander, use the landscape to keep yourself hidden for as long as possible. And there he appears again, ready to fire, and he'll disappear again.
Sources in Moscow claim that the Soviet delegation has already left Switzerland, and there are reports the Soviet Union is recalling its diplomatic staff from its missions in NATO countries.
This does not mean that war is bound to come, but there is a risk of this, and we must all be prepared for it. So, don't waste time. Start now.
Meanwhile, Britain is adopting a heightened state of readiness. All military and emergency services have been recalled, but the Prime Minister has urged the public to remain calm.
More details are given in the booklet, Protect and Survive. If you haven't got one yet, get one from the post office now. And start right away making your home and your family as safe as possible from nuclear attack.
All we did was train and train and train. A lot of this involved sleep deprivation. We knew we would be outnumbered when the war came, so we had to learn to be effective for long periods of time without sleep. We were on exercise approximately every month or so, and as a result we became very good at the job. We felt that British tank crews were the best in the world. We were prepared and we were very confident.
Start now on your fallout room and in a refuge. All these things can save your life. Start now.
We weren't afraid of the war. After all, a boxer doesn't train for months to avoid a fight. We never thought about losing. We were too well disciplined for that. We always thought, bring it on lads, come on, have a go if you think you're hard enough.
Tango 72, this is Tango 72 Alpha. Contact. Enemy recce forces approaching my position. This is it. Out.
So if the attack had happened, the Soviets would have always preempted their first advance with a massive barrage on whatever they thought NATO forces would be. So we can see coming on, there's a BMP followed up by the BRDM-1, the recce vehicle. The T-tank is coming round, circling round the flank, followed by the BRDM-2, and those of you can see it, the BTR-60 coming out, infantry on board. Vehicle coming out, we didn't talk about earlier, this massive looking, peculiar, long vehicle that those of you can see it coming round. This is the ACRV, or Artillery Command and Reconnaissance Vehicle. The Soviet system was such that they were very reliant on you had to do as you were told. There was no junior initiative in the Soviet army, so you needed command and control always. And of course, NATO forces, we were looking to knock out that command and control capability all the time, hoping it was like chopping off the head, the intelligence out of the body, then nothing would happen. And there we've got another T-54 tank moving on, taking up the flank position by the BMP-1. Soviet infantry, again, those you can see on the far corner of the battlefield, working their way forward. Debussing, as it's called, from some of the vehicles. And of course, during the course of their advance into NATO forces, one of the key things the Soviets would have been doing is trying to knock out all forms of communication. So hopefully NATO would be blind and not know quite what was going on. So that would mean sometimes Spetsnaz or special service troops would be blowing up telephone exchanges, making sure that we can't communicate in usual manner. And all the time NATO would be making great efforts to make sure it knew what was going on, trying to find out. So of course what we would be doing is sending forward again our own reconnaissance units to try and find out what on earth was going on. Where were these NATO, or where were the Warsaw Pact forces, how far are they advanced, and in what sort of numbers?
The Warsaw Pact forces struck at first light, launching a full-scale assault across the inner German border. A massive artillery bombardment preceded an armoured advance into West Germany, where Soviet troops have occupied key strategic bridges and road junctions. NATO has yet to comment on its intended response or the number of casualties sustained, but the situation remains confused.
So down the far end of the arena you can see coming forward, that's one of our NATO reconnaissance vehicles, that's a Lynx, Canadian vehicle, as I said earlier, very small, nice and nippy on the battlefield, so hopefully not too much of a target for the enemy to see. And of course in reality he'd be about a couple of miles away in the woods to report back on what he's seeing, radioing back, eyes on the ground. Vitally important that they're getting real-time information. Where are the Soviets? How strong are they? And what's the best way of us putting in a counter-attack? And as we've said earlier as well, NATO's made up of quite a number of countries. We've got Canadians, we've got the Germans. The Germans, of course, have got massive interest in what's going to happen because the fighting was likely to be on their land. And we've also got the Americans, and the first attack is going to be put in, counter-attack, by the American M60 tanks. our two M60s. We're not allowed to blow them up. They are rather precious museum objects, but they've been knocked out, if you can imagine, in the first engagement. So we're going to now call in our helicopter support, see what's going on the battlefield, reporting back what they're seeing and what they think is the best way of dealing with this current situation.
APCs, infantry deploying. This is Zero Alpha, copied, stand clear. Golf 1-1, this is Zero Alpha. Fire mission, 6 guns, grid 832884, range 2400, bearing 202. 2 platoons, enemy tanks and APCs advancing westward. Neutralize now for 1 minute.
Lynx, which those of you can see back down hiding behind, has called in not only an artillery barrage, but it's called in as a support. Here comes the attack of a Chieftain squadron coming on now, taking on the Russian tanks. Engaging with the Soviet armour now. And again, keep your eyes on the horizon. There's the Lynx again, eyes and ears of the battlefield. And neutralising the Russian armour, that means we can bring on our 432s with the armoured personnel carriers, with our infantry in for the section attack. Infantry have debuffed, and you can see them. They're now working their way forward onto the Soviet positions, running forward a section at a time, trying to keep in pretty much a straight line for the obvious reason, so you don't shoot the mate up the backside as you're advancing. Section commanders is keeping those guys moving forward. If you're under fire and you drop down, it takes an awful lot of welly to get back up again and carry on moving. And of course, as part of the discipline, the British infantry, very, very good. at actually carrying on moving and engaging with the enemy. Smoke, as you can see, being used to mask positions. Now flanking the Soviet positions there. Soviet infantry, they look like they're on the retreat at the moment. Sections of British infantry move up. It looked like they've defeated the Soviet infantry there, backing off behind their retreating out the way at the moment. So it looked like a successful attack or a successful counter from the British infantry there. Of the infantry are clearing the Soviet positions there as they've gone across in front of you.
British forces have driven back a hostile incursion into West Germany. Casualties are reported to be light. Meanwhile, a government spokesman has told the media the cabinet has been moved to a safe location. He urged the public to cancel all unnecessary travel and remain in or near their homes until further notice.
APCs and infantry. Confirm, copied. Zero Alpha, say again.
NATO's conventional forces failed to hold the Soviet invasion, and this is just a wrecking unit we've seen in front of us, they would have turned to their tactical nuclear weapons as the only way of defending themselves.
Are caused by weapons such as H-bombs or atom bombs. They are like ordinary explosions, only many times more powerful. They cause great heat and blast.
The government has decided that in the present state of international tension, you should be told how best to protect yourselves from the dangerous effects of nuclear attack. If this tension should lead to war, it is essential that you should have taken every possible precaution to safeguard your family, yourself, and your home.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Well folks, that was it for Tankfest 2013. It was an absolutely fantastic day. So glad I managed to get there and see all of this. For those of you who couldn't make it, well, at least you've got these videos to watch. The next museum visit that I'm going to be going to will be the War and Peace Show, which isn't really a museum, it's more a reenactment display, at Folkestone in Kent at the end of this month. So that will be the next item on the calendar. As always folks, take care out there, and I'll catch you next time.